Welcome to All Hail to the Pod. In this episode, Jim talks to historian Brian Hanley about the 1920 Longshoremen strike in New York, also known as the Irish Patriotic strike. To support All Hail to the Pod, visit patreon.com/All Hail to the Pod to get advance access, exclusive videos, gifts and more. Hope you enjoy this episode.
Brian, normally we start by saying welcome to the pod, but of course you're the first person to be on the pod twice, so welcome back to the pod.
Thank you very much.
No, it's good to see you again. And we're going to speak about the Longshoremen strike in New York today. I just wonder if you could, before we discuss that specifically, if we could maybe set the scene a bit. So this is 1920, so we're in the aftermath of World War I, after 1916 Rising, after the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. So maybe tell us a little bit about what was Irish politics like at that stage.
Well, of course, this 1920, the War of Independence had intensified and become really a military struggle during 1920. December 1918, the general election, Sinn Féin had won a massive mandate for independence. During 1919, they'd established Dáil Éireann. They'd attempted to politically gain support, and that was in part why they were looking to international forces as well. And slowly a military struggle had emerged, which really became a war by mid-1920. So during 1920, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries had arrived in Ireland. The IRA had escalated its campaign. And outside of Ireland, Irish Republicans were really trying to get the message that there was a war of independence taking place in Ireland out to a global audience. And that was in the context, as you say, of a world which was, in the words of the American Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, a world on fire. And that was the kind of context that Irish Republicans were operating in. And it really affected how they did attempt to work in different contexts.
And so that political context after the First World War in particular, where it had been Woodrow Wilson saying it was a war for small nations, right to self-determination. So there's in the aftermath of the war, there's a rise in nationalism and nations competing to become newly formed independent states. So it's in that context that Ireland are making their case, but also there's an uprising in labour struggles as well, a working class, and again in the aftermath of the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks take control, so that emboldens labour as well. So it's a very sort of volatile situation as you're describing, and in that context, republicanism decides to try and internationalise the struggle. They decide to try and garner support internationally, and of course one of the main places they look to is the United States. So maybe tell us a little bit about Irish America at that point in 1920. We're talking about De Valera going over there. William Melrose is already there. Harry Boland. These are like key Irish Republican figures at the time, and they're in the United States in 1920. So maybe tell us a little bit about that milieu that they were mixing in there.
Yeah, I mean, Irish America was very important, and it's really the high point of Irish American interest in Ireland. As people will probably be aware, ultimately there's around $5 million raised for the Dáil bond for the Irish Republic, which is far more in today's money. Most of that is raised from ordinary people, from ordinary Irish Americans. The Wall Street Journal sneers that it's Irish domestic servants and those of like or lesser intelligence who are contributing to the Dáil bond, which shows you in some ways also the position of the Irish in American society, because this isn't the Irish America of the 21st century. You're still talking about an Irish America that was very working class, and also with a significant proportion of people who'd been born in Ireland. So De Valera goes to America in part to try and win official recognition from the American political establishment. And that idea of the Irish Republic gaining a place at the post-war peace talks was a serious one. You know, and Sinn Féin did campaign very strongly on that slogan in 1918. Very quickly, it becomes apparent that the American political establishment are not going to entertain the Irish. Woodrow Wilson, by 1919, is clear he's not going to interfere in what he says as a domestic political affair for the British. The British have been allies of the US in the Great War, and actually De Valera faces at every turn nativist hostility from the Ku Klux Klan, from the American Legion, from people who say, but you were on the side of the Germans 3 years ago, so why should we recognize you? You're a foreign radical. So that's partly the context. De Valera doesn't have an easy time. He has to navigate a very tricky political situation. And a lot of his key allies in the US are people like Frank P. Walsh, John Fitzpatrick, are actually from Labour backgrounds. John Fitzpatrick of the Chicago Federation of Labour, Athlone born, a remarkable trade union leader in the context of the time. Frank P. Walsh is a Labour lawyer. And there's an Irish-American left, the Irish Progressive League. It contains people like Peter and Helen Golden, for example, who are a small but important part of kind of building a network to reach out to American Labour and also other ethnic groups, because what's noticeable when De Valera goes, but also particularly Muriel McSweeney and Mary McSweeney when they go, because actually De Valera draws huge crowds, fills Madison Square Garden, Fenway Park and so on. Muriel McSweeney gets bigger crowds in December 1920, and the McSweeney hunger strike has a huge impact. And what you get at those McSweeney rallies are Jewish political leaders, Indian leaders, as the press at the time would have described as Negro Americans and so on. So it's a wider movement than just the Irish. And it's also noticeable that when the Dáil bonds are being collected, of course, the majority of people who donate are Irish or Irish American. But again, Jewish Americans, sometimes Afro-Americans. There's a branch of the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic in Harlem, for example, and it contains both, again, the language of the time, both coloured and Irish members. So this is wider than the Irish, and there is an attempt by the Irish to reach out to others. There's the League of Oppressed Peoples, which Liam Mellows, Harry Boland, Patrick McCartan are involved in, which is essentially, as the name implies, in favour of independence for India, Egypt, Korea, and also raises the question of the pogroms in Eastern Europe against Jews and so on. So there's a much wider context, and the Irish are part of that too.
And of course, I mean, De Valera was famously born in the United States, sets himself up in the Waldorf Astoria, as you say, fills 70,000 people at Fenway Park, 50,000 people in Chicago. He's a massive figure. His tour across the country is huge. And then, but also, as you mentioned, Liam Mellows. Liam Mellows had a very different experience in the United States. He wasn't very comfortable there. He had a lot of political issues there, but he didn't really enjoy his time there. Is that fair to say? So there would be a different sort of experience for different members of the sort of Republican community that were there.
Yeah, and I mean, they all come in the same way. Interestingly, they're all smuggled in, and all of them are smuggled via Liverpool, and some of them had tougher times than others. The work on the ship nearly killed Harry Poland. He wasn't used to it at all. But Mellows and Pat McCartan had come in 1917, and they'd been arrested almost immediately because they were involved in a mission to try and get weapons and so on back to Ireland, and accused of collaborating with the Germans. So he spent time in prison in New York, and then Mellows is kind of immersed in a couple of different communities, but again, he's speaking to people on the left. He's speaking at meetings where he's talking about, socialism, what it means. He's saying, I don't know if you call it socialism, but we're in favor of freedom for everybody, and the Irish should not become the oppressors of everybody, and so on. And there's really Mellows and other people, Boland and so on, much more involved in the background. Also involved in logistical affairs, such as trying to get weapons to send to Ireland. De Valera, very much an extraordinary public figure, intending to be seen really as the leader of an independent Ireland, and that's the way he's promoted. While at the same time preaching an image of Ireland, which is quite interesting because, most Irish Americans, certainly in urban areas, were Catholic. De Valera was a devout Catholic, as was Boland and others. But De Valera never plays the religious card in America. It's quite interesting. He always talks about how the Irish Republic contains people of all faiths. And he's accompanied by this remarkable man, the Reverend James Irwin, particularly when he goes to the American South, who's a Presbyterian minister, who speaks again about how this is not a war about religion, this is a war for Irish freedom. And that's because, sometimes people imagine that De Valera, was on holidays in America while everything was going on in Ireland. I mean, the British are very concerned about America, so they put a huge effort into trying to counter the Irish message. So Lloyd George says the Irish are like the Confederates. They're trying to break away from the United Kingdom, from a legitimate state. The British also then claim it is a religious war, that these Irish Catholics are trying to drive out the Irish Protestants. And in America, which was still heavily Protestant, which sees a huge rise in anti-Catholic sentiment after the war, that was a potent message. So all these things had to be navigated on De Valera's tour, and that's what a lot of the arguments are about. But they all have different experiences, and Mellows certainly is more of a backroom figure than a public one.
And so if we move on to the Longshoremen strike itself, maybe the immediate catalyst for this is Daniel Mannix and Tevis McSweeney's hunger strike. Mannix, the Archbishop. Maybe say a little bit about Mannix as well for people maybe nobody is familiar with him as well with McSweeney.
Yeah, Daniel Mannix was Archbishop of Melbourne. He was a native of Ireland, and he essentially, during the First World War, had become the major oppositional figure to conscription in Australia. There's attempts to introduce conscription in Australia, and following the Easter Rising in particular, the Irish Catholic community, to a great extent, is radicalised and is opposed to conscription, even though many thousands of Irish Catholics had volunteered for the war. Conscription is seen as something different. And Mannix becomes the leader. He's also associated with the Australian Labour Party, and Irish Catholics become a big part of that constituency. So to a lot of Anglo-Australians, Mannix is seen as a traitor, and he's seen as a dangerously subversive figure. And he's more attracted, of course, to what's happening in Ireland. So he's embarks on a tour, travels to the United States. In August 1920, he sails for Ireland from the Hell's Kitchen, from the Chelsea Pier, essentially west side of Manhattan, where he's seen off by a huge crowd of Irish Republican well-wishers, including Eamon de Valera. And he's on a steamship called the Baltic, which is one of the big transatlantic liners that plies between Liverpool and New York. He doesn't get to Ireland. He intends to visit Ireland. The British are adamant that they're not going to let him. So he's met by the Royal Navy, who take him off the ship and bring him on shore at Penzance in Cornwall. And this provokes outrage in Ireland and in Irish America. Now, there's a kind of remarkable sequence of events here, because the docks, as you can imagine, in Manhattan were a pretty tough environment. There is a big Irish contingent on the docks. The International Longshoremen's Association, the union, had a strong Irish component, if a pretty conservative one led by a man called Joseph Ryan. But a group of what were called the Irish American women pickets, some of whom were Irish, some who were Irish American, had over the previous year began a kind of campaign of publicity stunts, picketing the White House, turning up at events where British politicians or diplomats were speaking, promoting the cause of Irish independence. And they start to picket the docks and call for a boycott of British shipping. Now, it's unclear. A man called James McGee, who was an official of the Ship Engineers Union, was involved with the IRA and with smuggling. He later claimed that he'd met with Harry Boland and that there was a plan essentially to try and close down the docks, or at least to close down British shipping. But certainly the pickets draw a response, and a lot of workers walk off the ships. There was a strong, again, big Irish component on the ships that sailed out of Liverpool and from other British ports. So seamen walk off. Longshoremen also stop work. It's not official. The union, the Longshoremen's Union, isn't quite sure what to say about it. And also then, as this strike, and it becomes a strike, begins to progress, you begin to see other groups on the docks, including Italians and African-American workers, drawn into it as well. And of course, as people might be aware, that historically been a lot of tension and indeed a lot of violence between those workers on the docks. And the Irish were seen by the Italians and by African-Americans as excluding them from large parts of dock work. But during the strike, the pickets issue appeals in Italian. They also specifically issue appeals to African-American workers. The Irish fight is the Negroes fight, and so on. We know very little about it, except thankfully some of it was kept, and actually it's in the National Library in Dublin. So some of the actual picket signs and leaflets and so on have been preserved, and they're in the manuscript section there, and hopefully when all the lockdowns are over, people will be able to access them again. One thing I was disappointed about with the whole situation last year was that I hoped there would be some kind of public commemoration of this event, because it remains relatively little known. Bruce Nelson has written quite a bit about it. Joe Doyle 20 years ago maybe wrote something too, but it should be something that in both Ireland and America that people should be more aware of, I think.
Yeah. I think in Nelson's book he mentions that some of the placards had on it down with the Pirates of Penzance as well. When they
That's
were,
right, yeah.
I mean, and obviously McSweeney's hunger strike is underway at this time. Now we're now in the just beginning the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the 1981 hunger strike. But obviously, hunger strikes have got a long history in Irish republicanism, and McSweeney's one is one of the most famous examples of that. And that, as you said earlier, that it was a massive thing in Irish America as well. So you have the Mannix controversy at Penzance. then we also have McSweeney's hunger strike going on as well. So can you maybe just give us an idea of the scale of that? Because I mean, I think it's very difficult for us sitting here now. We're in a very different world, and Irish republicanism is a very different place. But what was it like in Irish America, in New York at that time, in the middle of McSweeney's hunger strike?
Yeah, it had a huge impact. Some of the Irish Republican diplomats said more than any other issue, it inflamed the Irish, but also America itself. And again, here you had the Lord Mayor of Cork starving himself to death in a British prison. It had a huge impact in Britain as well, and across the globe, and all kinds of people. I mean, again, it's one of the contradictions at the time. The Mussolini's newspaper in Italy has the agony of McSweeney on its front page. I mean, this is a huge story, and it happens at a period when things are escalating anyway. So during the McSweeney hunger strike period, Kevin Barry is executed in Dublin, the first IRA volunteer executed during that period, and a huge issue in Dublin, again, in terms of the response to it. There's a half-day general strike and so on as well. In India and elsewhere, the story of McSweeney's hunger strike is having an impact. So this is really a global phenomenon, and McSweeney's name is known globally, and certainly the reaction to it and the British treatment of McSweeney really angers and inflames opinion, and again intensifies the Republican effort.
And I wonder if you could maybe just say a little bit about this, touched on the attempt by Republicans to internationalize the struggle, but also in the United States to make connections with other peoples in struggle or other diaspora communities with Italians. But for instance, De Valera, you mentioned India, De Valera at that point speaks to the Friends of Freedom for India. And so he's clearly, explicitly in the United States trying to make that connection between what's happening in Ireland and what's happening in other countries like India. Can you maybe just say a little bit about how successful that was, or what the attitudes were for the Indian perspective towards that?
Yeah, I mean, the connections had been made at a local level in the US over the previous decade. In fact, there were Indian communities in San Francisco and in New York and so on. And right from certainly the 1910s, they are connecting with Irish radicals. John Devoy, again, a very complex man, but his newspaper, The Gaelic American, would have publicized Indian events. And the big three really in the anti-colonial world in 1920 are Ireland, India, and Egypt. In India in 1919, you have the Amritsar Massacre, which Indians today call the Jalwandar Bag Massacre. But in 1919, people would have said Amritsar. No, it's not an accident that when the Croke Park Massacre happens in November 1920, that immediately the Irish newspapers talk about the Amritsar of Ireland. I mean, that's in everybody's mind. You also then have an Indian revolution or an Egyptian revolution in 1918, 1919, again, in the context of this demand for self-determination. In the various cities across the world where the diaspora communities exist, in London, for example, big imperial hub, the Irish there, a man called Art O'Brien, who's the Sinn Féin representative in London, is in regular contact with representatives of the Indian and the Egyptian nationalist movements. Again, within a couple of years, remarkable Indian MP, communist MP, Saklatavala, is very associated with the Irish cause and is a conduit for connections between the international communist movement and the Irish. You also then in the United States have connections in every city where they coexist between the Indians and the Egyptians and the Irish. And De Valera at that rally for the Friends of Freedom for India says, we also send our greetings to those fighting in Egypt and in Persia. I think it's very interesting, particularly in the context now, because there's a bit of a debate in Ireland, and I don't know if people will have seen it. The president, Michael D. Higgins, had an article in The Guardian a few weeks ago talking about imperialism and about how in Britain, that's the imperial legacy in Ireland has been overlooked. And within Irish academia, that's actually quite controversial because very few Irish historians talk about imperialism. And there was an article recently about how the Irish used whiteness and so on. I mean, the Irish identified very strongly with India and with Egypt. And what Irish Republican figures, certainly what people like Sean T. O'Kelly, one of De Valera's allies, would have said is that the Irish had a shameful history in that we'd provided the foot soldiers in India and in Egypt and regiments like the Connaught Rangers and so on, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. I mean, thousands of Irish men had been to India and Egypt 100 years ago because they'd been there as British soldiers. And we can say that many of them had no interest in politics or were there for economic reasons and so on. But it is part of upholding the empire. And what De Valera and others would have said in 1920 was that we can show our solidarity now as a way of atoning for this. So it's not the same as saying Irish people today had a role in the empire, but certainly 100 years ago there was deep connections. The deputy governor of the Punjab was a Tipperary Catholic, Sir Michael O'Dwyer. It doesn't mean everybody in Tipperary had a connection to the empire, but he certainly did. So there was both the feeling of these countries are fighting for freedom and we support them, but also we can practically help them by not sending any more soldiers to uphold the empire. And also then by 1921, I mean, in the Richard Mulcahy papers, the IRA chief of staff at the time, he's got documents where the IRA are giving advice to the Egyptians and the Indians about potential military tactics. So had things gone on, I'm not sure how it would have worked out. But there were, again, all kinds of connections. And among some Republicans, at least, by 1921, there was growing disillusion at the failure to achieve recognition in America officially. And one journal, New Ireland, says, essentially, America has let us down. We're not going to get support from the American establishment, but our brothers in pain, the Egyptians and the Indians, will be true to us. So again, there is a feeling of solidarity with these colonial peoples. And they do know each other. I mean, there's a delegation from Egypt supposed to come to Ireland, and that doesn't happen because of the signing of the treaty in 1921. But of course, people make connections in Britain, certainly in London. There are personal connections, and also then in the United States. And how that would have developed had the struggle for independence gone on longer, again, is quite interesting. But the British are very aware of that. I mean, I should say that Sir Henry Wilson, for example, the British chief of Imperial staff, he's of the opinion that in fighting the IRA, we are fighting New York and Calcutta and Moscow and so on, that, if you lose Ireland, you lose the empire, and then perhaps you lose England itself. So this is in the context of the imperial mind too.
Yeah, it's fascinating. See, and when you mentioned whiteness and the ruling race, we can see in the United States it's still a huge issue as it is here and everywhere else. But at that point, it was still a big issue as well in 1920. And I'm just wondering if we could maybe say a bit about, there seemed to be simultaneously the delegation making a plight or sort of plea to the United States government that Ireland should be an independent nation because it's the last white nation that's not an independent nation type. And they're making that case while simultaneously trying to make these alliances with other people internationally, including with the African diaspora. And just before the Longshoremen strike, we have Marcus Garvey, a sort of massive controversial figure in New York at that time. And he sends De Valera a message for a huge rally at Madison Square Garden saying basically, you have our support, our solidarity, our sympathy with Ireland. So maybe say a little bit about that, about the ruling race and how De Valera in particular tries to sort of navigate those two different positions, he appealing for solidarity and responding to that, but also making this claim about Ireland being a white nation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex situation because firstly, there's great enthusiasm among a kind of diverse group of black radicals for the Irish Revolution. Marcus Garvey is absolutely transfixed with Ireland. And he really, again, along with India and Egypt, sees that struggle as extremely significant. And in the paper of the Garvey movement, The Negro World, there's a lot of coverage given to the Irish issue. He also has a headquarters in Harlem called Liberty Hall, for example. And his group are certainly involved in negotiations with the African-American longshoremen during that strike. So it's the Garveyite movement in many ways who are key to making a connection in August 1920 on the New York docks, during that incident. You also then have people like Hubert Harrison, Cyril Briggs, Claude McKay, West Indian radicals. McKay is in Britain, I think, for a while, the others in America, who really see the Irish struggle as one of them describes the most epic struggle in history. They're very, very enthusiastic about Ireland, completely in support of the Irish demand for independence. And then among African Americans, people like the socialist leader A. Philip Randolph, writing in a paper called The Messenger, W.E.B. Du Bois writing in his paper, The Crisis, probably the most significant African-American intellectual, also support the Irish cause, also believe Irish independence is justified. I mean, A. Philip Randolph during the Longshoremen strike says, Negroes are striking with Irishmen. Perhaps someday the Irish will strike for us. But there is a difference between the African-American and the West Indian view. Garvey and others had grown up under British rule, and I think are very enthusiastic about the Irish rebellion from that point of view. The African Americans had a much more jaundiced view of the Irish because they'd grown up with Irish Americans. And both Du Bois and Randolph also say, but in general, the Irish as a race are the people Negroes dislike the most. And they make no bones about the fact that there is a lot of acrimony between those communities. Whereas Garvey doesn't tend to refer to that at all. It might reflect his own separatist politics. He thinks Ireland's important, and if Ireland wins, we all win. So he tends to play down any tensions there might be, whereas the African Americans are much more explicit about that. The Irish Republicans themselves, and it's really, in some ways, it's depressing because they're in America not only at a time of great labor upheaval and kind of nativist backlash, but also the Red Summer of 1919, when you've got ferocious race riots across the United States. So they couldn't escape knowing that there's been a massive increase in lynching, that there's been race riots in Chicago. De Valera speaks in Chicago 2 weeks after the worst riots in the city's history, and he just says nothing. He doesn't refer to them at all. And what the Irish very carefully tend to do is firstly not say anything that could be construed as sympathetic to African Americans. They say nothing about them, even though at a local level, African Americans in some cases are involved in support for the Irish Republic. And then they also use this phrase. De Valera uses it, Harry Boland uses it, Mary McSweeney uses it, James Irwin uses it, that we are the last white nation in slavery. Now, in the American context, people hearing it would say, well, you deserve freedom more than someone else. You don't have to say you do. That's the way it would have been perceived. And Erskine Childers says it as well in articles for the British press during 1920. And Claude McKay actually writes, this is a strange position for a rebel to have. Why can't you just say everybody should be entitled to freedom? But there was a pecking order in terms of kind of hierarchies. And the Egyptians and the Indians, for example, would have been seen as very different to Black Africans, even by many radicals. I mean, the British labor movement at the time has this same issue about, when the French, for example, send colonial troops into the Ruhr and so on, there's this huge upheaval in Europe about how disgraceful it is that Black soldiers are to be sent to police white people. And you get that on the elements of the left arguing that as well. So the Irish are very careful. I mean, De Valera does make a famous speech when he's made an honorary chief of the Chippewa Nation in Wisconsin, and he says to them, I speak to you in Gaelic because I want to show you that though I'm white, I'm not of the English race. We, like you, are a people who have suffered, and I can feel a sympathy for you that comes only from one who can understand as Irishmen can. You say you are not free, neither are we free, and I sympathize with you because we are making a similar fight. As a boy, I read and understood of your slavery and longed to become one of you. I call upon you, the truest of all Americans, to help us in our struggle for freedom. There's an iconic photograph of De Valera with the headdress, which you'll find if you Google it. So it's interesting he would say that to a Native American audience. But the much bigger racial question is really off limits. I've struggled to find any case of, Irish Republicans explicitly referring to it in that period. And I think then for Garvey, that didn't matter so much as the Irish freeing themselves, because this would have a knock-on effect. The African Americans then were a little bit more, aware of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, we've just before we finish, we've discussed the sort of the politics of the time and where that struggle for Irish independence politically was heading and what they were trying to do, as well as the details of the Longshoremen strike. But of course, there's something else happening at that period, to go back to the beginning, which is that the IRA are engaged in a revolutionary war against the British. And so clearly the ports are a key site of struggle for them. And as you mentioned, Harry Boland and others had spoke about making the connection with Labour explicitly for war means that if the English wage war on our people, Boland says, we need to make sure that we can hit them back here in terms of an impact on shipping and what have you in the States. So there was, as well as everything else that was going on about Mannix and McSweeney, there was also that sort of logistical thing happening about moving people and arms about, but also how it would impact the war effort as well from the IRA's perspective. So maybe say a little bit about that, about how the role that the ports played during that period.
Yeah, I mean, Boland certainly and others were very aware that the IRA were up against it in Ireland. And certainly as the war went on and the British introduced more and more regular troops, I mean, they were heavily outgunned. I mean, by the IRA's own estimates, they had something like 3,000 rifles in 1921. Now, according to the latest brigade roll figures, there were over 100,000 men enrolled. So the IRA had far more people than it had weapons. So trying to get arms was a huge problem. And they were difficult. They were relatively easy to get in Europe, which had just had a war, and places like Germany were like a giant arms bazaar in 1920, but actually getting them to Ireland was problematic. So ports were important. So in Hamburg and in Antwerp and so on, in Leith and in Glasgow, and particularly Liverpool, you had Irish workers, often connected back to the old IRB, Irish Republican Brotherhood Network, who became extremely important in terms of moving weaponry. I mean, the IRA was able to get explosives from the mines in the west of Scotland and from Lancashire as well. Everything tended to go through Liverpool, where there was a big network on the docks, and then across to Ireland, usually to Dublin or possibly Drogheda, Dundalk, Newry, and so on, as well as various stages. But then there was also communications between Britain and Ireland and America, all had to be in secret. So these came through sailors as well, and were being brought again. Everything tended to go through Liverpool and get to Dublin. So in order to facilitate that, you had networks of Irish Republicans in New York and Boston and Montreal and St. John's in Canada as well. You had them in all the British ports to an extent, but particularly Liverpool, and then in a smaller way in parts of Europe too, particularly, as I say, in the German ports and so on. In Dublin, a unit of the IRA Q Company was established from among dockers, seamen, and port workers, some of whom had been involved in the Citizens' Army, and some of whom had been through the 1913 lockout and so on. And they're quite interesting in terms of even they're far more blue collar than much of the rest of the IRA in Dublin. And their job was to essentially facilitate this smuggling. They were working on the British and Irish boats, on the smaller boats, on the Guinness boats and so on that went back and forth. And then Liverpool had the transatlantic liners, and they would have had connections with the shipping trade unions and so on that were very, significant in terms of trying to bring in arms, most of which come in very small quantities. So it's a constant, there's day by day accounts of it in some of the archives in terms of trying to get weapons in, to buy them off ex-soldiers or to steal them, to connect with different people. British radicals, for example, in some cases involved in this too. And then connections with port workers in the United States. So the shipping strike in 1920, or the Longshoremen strike, there is discussion of whether Boland and others thought this could be extended to include ultimately sabotage of British ships and attacks if the war went on. And certainly the IRA in England after November 1920 begins offensive operations in a way they hadn't before. Now, they don't in Scotland or in Wales, essentially. They carry these attacks out in England itself. Double-edged effect of that. Firstly, they do raise the awareness of the IRA and carry out retaliations for what's happening in Ireland, but also disrupts all the smuggling, because now the police are paying much more attention to these networks than they had before. But again, it's part of the story really of this kind of global effort. Boland was, again, was quite explicit about how left to ourselves in Ireland, we can't hope to win the final victory. We have to go to all these other places and enlist support there if we want to bring Britain to its knees. So this is, as I say, part of the global effort.
It is fascinating. I seen that one of the great quotes that I seen was Patrick McCartan said that one of the people who were recruited for the IRA in Liverpool around about the docks, he said he was a man who would steal a bridle off a nightmare, but he could be absolutely relied upon in Irish matters. And I thought that was like, we talk about all the sort of leaders and the key people and the politics there, but that was the reality on the ground. Brian, thank you very much. That is a fascinating discussion on a period of history there, working class history and Irish revolutionary history, which I think the centenary was missed a bit last year. So it's great to catch up on that. Thank you.
A pleasure, and thanks again, Jim.
Thanks for listening. All Hail to the Pod is produced by Cowgate Media. For more information, follow us on social media or visit 107cowgate.com.